Well, first of all, thank you, Julia and Jeff and others from CEND for putting this symposium together. When I saw the agenda, when I first got the invitation, looked at the agenda, even though I live in Geneva, seemed like the trip would be worthwhile. And I'm sure by the end of the day, I'll find it even more useful than I could have imagined. So thank you for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to talk about FIND and how FIND as an organization sort of plays a role in this area of diagnostic diseases and infectious disease diagnostics, and how we can continue to work with partners in pushing the agenda for making diagnostics sort of forefront of what is needed to manage patients. I also want to thank all the organizers who've been continuing and continue till late last evening to make sure that all the logistics are taken care of. So thank you to that team as well. It is a miracle that computers connect and project without issue. That is the third piece of it. So glad for that final piece as well. So I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at FIND. I've been there for about a year. Many of you, or some of you at least, may have worked with FIND, or it's been around for over 15 years, and there are parts of the organization that I'm getting to learn. So there are many areas that we touch, as you see, as I go through the talk, and I'll try to give you an overview of what FIND does today. So I want to first sort of put this slide up and really ask the question, it's an ice cream truck, and it's really from Manila, Philippines. And the question is, what does an ice cream truck have to do with infectious disease diagnostics? And I want you to hold your thought and come back and talk about this a little later. But let's first begin with the topic or the theme of my presentation, which is really what FIND is focused on, which is resource-limited settings, and look at where patients present initially when they have some kind of symptom. This might be an example of a healthcare facility. It could be something smaller than this or something bigger than this, depending on where you are. But let's call this a typical one. But in reality, what we know is no matter where they present, majority of the cases, you find that they present to areas where there is no appropriate diagnostic available. So they may present there, there may be some healthcare workers or some limited kind of tools available, but really not appropriate, adequate for necessarily every signs and symptoms of different kinds of diseases that could be presented at that particular facility. So just to sort of look at TB as an example, if it's, say 3 in 4 people present to facilities where there are no appropriate diagnostics, the net result is you end up with the statistic that many of you working in the TB area may know, which is about 4 million undetected cases. And these are essentially means that even though TB is one of the better funded of the tropical disease or disease burden in this area, if even there you find this such large burden, you can imagine what happens in Helminthic diseases and others that are truly the neglected tropical diseases of this area. And this story is the same, HCV, another example where less than 20% of the people are diagnosed. And while both TB and HCV are benefiting from better drug regimen, better treatment, and there are better ways to manage the patients, if you don't have diagnostics, you're really not identifying the patients at the right time, and therefore the impact that you can have with these drugs tend to be lower, and therefore the disease burden continues unabated. You can make this case in a most recent Ebola outbreak in 2014, where had there been appropriate diagnostics at the point of need, where the patient's present and where the patient management actually takes place with appropriate rapid diagnostic tools, you could have done a much better job, both in terms of the number of lives saved or impacted, and also the cost burden, which is still continuing in many of these areas. As you can see, it's not something that just goes away. So overall, if you look at, there have been many talks and symposia on sort of the types of diseases that afflict these regions, and sort of take a look at these 28 what you might call a poverty-related disease, meaning things that are not really common in the more resource-rich areas. 21 of those are missing critical diagnostics. So they may have some kind of diagnostic, but the critical ones that are needed to make decision often are not available. And so this is a large number. And if you sort of look at it even further, many of those may be available but are underutilized or not utilized appropriately. There's an old saying that Alan Merrieu actually made quite a few times, which is about, without diagnostics, medicine is blind. And we continue to say that without appropriate diagnostic tools, you cannot have a sustainable management of these diseases. From a public health, which is where most of you are focused, it is very clear that if you don't have appropriate diagnostic tools, essentially you're shooting in the dark and making as good a guess as anybody else can, and that's not really adequate nor appropriate when you think of some of these settings that you need to go do. So what FIND essentially was set up to do, and this is FIND is a nonprofit organization based in Geneva, Switzerland, and came out of WHO in 2003 with support from Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation at the time, as an organization to focus on getting diagnostics and make diagnostics part of the agenda in these low and middle income settings. Along with DNDi and the other organizations that sort of came up at the same time, focused more on the drug side of it. So it's really set up as a NGO focused on diagnostics as its primary target. And to this day, we are exclusively focused on diagnostics. So all of our effort that we do is diagnostics focused and diagnostics related things. We are based in Geneva, which is where about 70 of our scientists and clinical trial and all that staff reside, but we also have presence across the globe, depending on, in India, we have a fairly large office that does a lot of downstream activities. We also have activities in other sub-Saharan Africa, as well as Southeast Asia and Latin America. So we're spread in areas where there are actual needs, and work with partners. Essentially, all of our activity, as you can see from the diagram there, it's FIND has a role, and we are completely 100% funded through public funding, government donors, private donors, or other donors, and we are essentially chaperones of this investment dollars. And our role is in coordinating and leading sort of the effort in making sure that appropriate diagnostics and solutions are developed that can be used in the setting. So we are really channeling what might be different pockets of money in through various partners, often through technology developers, but also downstream clinical trial activities and so on, to make sure that appropriate and adequate diagnostics are being developed and affordable. And that's really the focus of what we try to do. And we are also very closely linked with and collaborate with WHO. We are, in fact, recently we became a WHO collaborating center for diagnostics. And so it gives us a lot of interaction, as well as downstream getting into policies and getting into regulatory policies and so on makes it easier being a collaborating center with the WHO. So, symposia like these, where I see both industry as well as academia represented, is ideal, because this is not a solution that any one organization, any one kind of effort can do. This really truly needs to be broader. And in fact, there are other aspects that I won't even talk about, which is downstream implementation side of it, that also need to come into play. But what we try to do then is sort of act as a central coordinator across all these different organizations. So today, given sort of my focus, which is more on the R&D side and technology and development, I'll focus a little bit on the what is needed on the upfront side of things. And this is sort of addressing the challenges of in vitro diagnostics. And this is sort of a thing you can think of. And before I joined FIND for a couple of decades, I was with a small startup that eventually was part of Abbott. And so the slide that I put up here could be as true in a high income setting as it is in a low income setting, which is if you sort of think of valleys of death, or areas where between your initial concept to how you want to implement, there are many gaps. And if you don't take into account all these gaps, essentially you're falling into the valley as opposed to having bridge across them to be able to transcend them. So you can think of a low resource setting. If you don't take into account the kinds of things that are important in those settings, and you design a product that is not appropriately designed for the end user, it's not going to go very far. So a lot of the failure happens, even though you may realize the failure much later, the cause of the failure is often way up front. So making sure that you have appropriate design, appropriate needs identified, and talk to adequate number of partners who can sort of highlight where the gaps are, where the challenges are, and how do you address them. So that's one of the biggest gaps. But even if you sort of have all of that taken into account, often people forget that just because you have a CE-IVD or an FDA-regulated product doesn't mean that automatically people are just buying it off the shelf. I have a first-hand experience of having products that even in other settings don't go, but definitely in a resource-limited setting, that's a challenge. How do you take into account local country requirements? What are the challenges of implementing some of these? Who are the people who are actually going to be using it? How are they going to be using it? And what are the policy decisions that need to go into account? So that sort of forms the big portion of the second valley of death, as I would call it. And finally, on the downstream side is a continuing, sort of support of all of these. How do you get them into the hands of the final end user? What evidence do they have that by implementing it, you can actually make a difference? And how do you then convince the ministries of health or other private, organizations that are involved in distributing as well as supporting these implementations downstream, and making sure there's actually a pull from the places where the need is most in order to sustain the business. Because ultimately, if you don't take care of that, you can succeed in the first two, but not still have a product. So you can end up, sort of falling in the gap. So what FIND was set up to do, and what we sort of talk about are 4 pillars, 3 of which are depicted here, and the 4th is essentially something that goes across the board, which is evidence building and publications and advocacy and so on. But if you sort of think of the 3 areas as 3 focal points or 3 pillars that FIND works on, first is an area that I would call Catalyze Development. So this is more where I would say it's the R&D centric, understanding the needs, understanding what kinds of problem we're trying to solve, what kind of solutions exist, and are the two compatible? How do we make them compatible? How do we make sure that the product that get developed ultimately will meet the needs? And so we work with a variety of stakeholders in defining the product needs, what we call the TPP or product requirements, and so on. Along with taking right from the beginning, taking into account what is the end goal. It's going to be some affordable pricing, because you can't start product development without knowing that you can actually have the product be purchased or used in at the end. So all of these sort of come into sort of the first bucket of what I would call Catalyze Development. I'll spend a couple of more minutes on that in the next slide. The second piece of it, which is a big focus of what FIND does, and a lot of FIND's expertise sort of comes in, is in actually going beyond the early specifications and sort of feasibility kind of approach to actually doing evidence building through clinical trials and continued evidence building in the field, working with end users who are actually going to be implementing it. We are right now working, for instance, in Nigeria with a Lassa fever program. So, we can sort of conceive the best possible diagnostic, or even, it might work, but you go there and find most people are not trained to do even the simplest of operations. And then you realize everything you've done is going to take another 3 years before you can actually get this stuff. So a lot of what we do up front is to make sure that we think about who's the end user, how are they going to actually use it, and build the support and training and so on. And once we go past that, the enabling access, where we again continue to demonstrate. Perhaps it's a regulatory approved product, but you need to continue demonstrating that it actually has an impact, such that there is a pull towards using these diagnostics in the field at the end. Taking all of these into account at every stage is actually critical. So in terms of catalyzing development or R&D, we over the course of FIND's existence, and definitely in the last 5 years, which has been sort of a recent sort of renewal of our strategy and so on, we've focused a lot on a number of disease areas, from TB to malaria, fever, lots of neglected tropical diseases, as well as HIV, HCV, and some emerging pandemics, as well as AMR, is sort of work across ultimately technology has to be developed by qualified, competent people who can really bring solutions that are meaningful, that can actually work in the field. So we work in defining sort of the product specification. Like I said, is the TPP process that we do this, and we do this very often and in a public manner, work with WHO and other stakeholders, and bring different opinions as well as leaders into the mix right in the early part of it, such that the product is really well defined. But we go beyond that, and for those of you who have worked with us in different aspects may know, we sort of can offer a lot of the people who we have are, experts in certain areas where we can bring in, there may be some regulatory expertise or clinical or other design expertise, technology expertise, and so on, that we can, we may not know everything about your product, but we know what would work, and so try to be the match between those two. We do a lot of technology scouting. When I come to meetings like these, I'm trying to look at what technologies are out there and how can we bring them to fruition in the areas that we're trying to target. So we do this both actively and passively through our website. You can actually go and submit some of your ideas if you had some novel ideas where you think you can solve certain problems, or sometimes we solicit specific through RFPs and others specific ways of recruiting technology to bring it into focus. Ultimately, again, what we're trying to do is we are governed by where the donor dollars are sort of driven towards where they want to see these development happening, and how do we then work with appropriate technology partners who can then provide those technologies as a solution. And one of the things that has been very successful for us as we have built a large clinical trial network going across is specimen banking. So we've done that actually quite routinely for TB, and we're expanding that to other diseases as well now. As we collect specimens, we realize that many of the developers, often the biggest challenge is they don't have access to appropriate samples and so on. And so how do we make sure that there's a plan for some of these? And that's a big part of what we do on the sample banking side. And the kinds of technologies we work with is really not, while we obviously are very price conscious of the end user, but we recognize that certain things may need lab-based solutions. So we are not just looking at any one type of diagnostic. So I just give sort of 4 examples here. It could be a rapid lateral flow test that is used right up front in the field, which is deployable easily and really requires minimal training. Or it could be a rapid molecular test, perhaps one that could be used in the field very quickly. But often some of these may need some kind of a power and lab infrastructure. So we do work with others who may need a lab setup. Could be lab in a box and a mobile platform or mobile unit, or it could be an actual physical infrastructure. But how can we then take advantage of all of those as well in pushing the boundaries, because some of these emerging solutions that you need may require something like a next-gen sequencing. And how do we bring some of those advances into the resource-limited setting? Taking into account, it's not just about the technology, it's really whether it's solving the problem that we're trying to do, and can we bring that to scale and bring that to bear for a particular problem. But once we sort of have technologies, have identified, as I said, we spend a lot of time in different disease areas, and we have done this over the last several years, is work with clinical trial partners in country so that we are actually testing the products that are being developed in the field of use, in the setting of use across the globe. A lot of trials in Sub-Saharan Africa, India, Southeast Asia, and so on. And this is, again, to make sure that the products are fit for purpose and usable in the actual field of setting that we want to do. And this is a continuing area. Depending on where where your technology might be, we could sort of look at what the appropriate setting for use is and how do we do the actual clinical trial. But it's not just clinical trial for registration, which is clearly one aspect of it, and we are working quite actively on that. But it's also one where we want to continue evidence building, meaning that technology exists, but how do you show that using the technology? What are the other things that you need to bring to bear along with that particular technology to really form a solution such that there's an impact from a patient management or a patient benefit perspective? And that's really what sort of comes down to the third pillar, which is more about the accelerating access. Access, I'm the chief scientific officer. I have a counterpart who's the chief access officer, essentially whose focus is understanding from the end user side, how can you sort of focus on this available, affordable, and adopted and appropriate diagnostics? And what are the different things? How do you, like I said earlier, we need to have sort of a pull from the market. How does the either Ministry of Health or who is the decision maker understand that the diagnostic that they are trying to get into the field is actually needed? There's an impact of bringing that to the particular use. And building evidence on that, building models, publishing a lot of this data, all of that sort of becomes part of our effort in access. Ultimately, such that they are, and this is one where ultimately what we want is not necessarily that somebody else has to go do the implementation. It's how can it be done with the local resources, because that's the only way for it to be sustainable in many of these cases. At least in the easy-to-use RDT kind of setting, we want to make sure that they are done with as little external intervention as possible to make it more scalable and usable. Besides developing the core diagnostic tools, like I said, specimen banking is one example of support structure that we built over the course of time, because we felt both for our own needs, but ultimately realize this is exactly what is plaguing the industry in terms of the gaps. But one of the key aspects of what we worked on in the last few years was a simple sample transfer device, which now is being used. Like I said, we've over 130 million of these blood transfer devices that were originally developed with finding the need for that and seeing that that's something that'll be extremely valuable to now everybody who's developing malaria RDT sort of uses that as a simple sample transport device. We also work, in besides the biobanking, we're not much into early stage discovery because our funding sort of starts with product as a mind. So there are many discovery that we can't get into just based on our focus. But once it sort of gets to the point where we know it could be potentially translated into a product, that's where we sort of and we maintain this through a biomarker diagnostics database. Started with TB again. A lot of the work we do actually started with TB because that's been the main area we focused on for a long time. Although we now work on a number of different disease areas, but we also have on the access side tools to look for things such as how do you have data sharing communication. So worked with SIM card providers in making sure that those are accessible and affordable. How can we, because it's not something that we normally think about, but ultimately we can talk about connected diagnostics, but if every time you transfer data, it costs you a bundle, nobody's going to be able to transfer any data. So these are small but necessary steps that we need to think about from an overall solution perspective. So we do a lot of that as well. So just to sort of summarize in this part of it, essentially we have done this over the course of just in the last, since 2015, if I look at data, we have brought a number of diagnostic tools to market, worked with WHO in getting them through policy and regulatory approval strategy, gone through clinical validation, clinical trials, patient enrollment, as well as enabling access, essentially training in-country workers, people who can actually use some of these diagnostics when the need arises. And that's something that we continue to sort of emphasize and focus on. And like I said, shaping the agenda, which is really how we sort of do advocacy or publication, it's something that we focus a lot on because diagnostics as is a neglected area in many things. And if we as a community don't sort of push that agenda forward, it'll not go anywhere. So that's a lot of what we do. And sort of breaking it down just a little bit, I won't go through this slide in detail, but we have done this over a number of disease areas quite successfully, and we continue to work in many of these. TB, of course, is our, with a gene expert a few years ago, was the introduction of the first molecular system into a resource-limited setting, which was initially thought not possible, but ultimately showed that it actually has so much value that it actually was the right thing to do. Malaria RDTs or fever, now we were looking at different biomarkers and trying to do rapid triage. HCV with a better drug regimen. We have sort of focused on molecular as well as RDT-based approach to rapid diagnostics. NTD, we've worked very successfully in several countries in eliminating the human African trypanosomiasis, the sleeping sickness, which was sort of our flagship NTD product. But out of that, now we have other NTDs that we focus on, including leishmania, Buruli ulcer, and most recently we've just launched schistosomiasis RDT development. Again, this is an area where I'm not going to talk much about it today, but if anybody wants to know more detail, I'm glad to talk about it, where there is a lot of, like other Helminthic diseases, there's a lot of mass drug administration kind of approach where you're throwing drugs into these areas without really looking at the ability to get rapid diagnostics. And as a result, it's really not being cost effective, neither on the drug side nor on the patient management side. And how can we improve some of that as we go towards elimination for many of these NTDs? Just to sort of give a few specific examples before I close, Buruli ulcer is one of the NTDs where we sort of look at it as clearly it's a neglected among the neglected tropical diseases. Very few people here may even have heard of Buruli ulcer. It's a mycobacterial ulcerans causing, that causes the underlying disease. But it starts off as a little skin irritation, might grow into some, full-blown disease. But by the time you get to the stage of disease, it's quite late, and you end up with lifelong scars. This is really, the impact of this is sort of broad. Everything from children to adults with, there is stigma, there is everything that goes with one of these skin diseases that ultimately causes a huge problem. There is a oral therapeutic that's available, but not a rapid diagnostic solution, which means if you don't diagnose early enough, the availability of the oral therapeutic is really not valuable, and people continue to suffer. So what we've done here is sort of working with Swiss Tropical Health Institute, Swiss TPH. We've identified biomarkers that potentially could be, that appear to work sort of in the lab-based setting. And now we're working with a diagnostic company to develop this into an RDT. But this is just the first step. But there's still a long way to go for us to make sure that this is actually going to be usable and actually starts to, the question is, these kind of ulcers, how do you actually do the sampling? So it might be one of these where the RDT may exist. If you had to go do a skin biopsy kind of thing, that's not necessarily immediately translatable into a field use setting. So how do you match what the sample type is and what the sample needs are to where the end product is going to be used? And so, looking at some non-invasive sampling, for instance, might be a way to improve this. Affordability, some of these kinds of tests, you really can't, much as, I want to say every development needs dollars. At the end of the day, the end users who are where you're trying to do them really don't have those dollars to buy them. So how do you make it affordable and really usable? Even in TB, where clearly a lot of advances have been made, but like I said, there is this sort of missing millions that continue to keep the disease from being eliminated. There's a ongoing cycle of transmission that is going on. And one of the activities we have done in this is over almost a decade of work, starting 8 to 10 years ago, but now coming to fruition, is a LAM-based test that appears to be very promising, where we've recently shown data that says that this could work. So we've sort of done the early, based on all the specifications and so on, a number of years that we spent in working with partners, identifying the right antibodies, identifying the right partners who can develop this, who can make it into a product, who are committed to doing it. All of that sort of takes us past the first valley. But then now we are at the stage of first proving the sort of the clinical trial. We're just starting the clinical trial, that it actually works in the setting, and it's currently for HIV positive patients. Does it work in the setting that we're trying to do? But then going beyond that, what is the sustainability of a product like this? How do you make sure that this kind of a product that can have an impact in addressing the missing millions is sustainable in the field, both in terms of the demand generation as well as in supporting the product through the setting of use that we're actually focused in. And in sort of keeping the theme of this meeting with AMR, also a little bit, I just wanted to sort of touch upon a slide on febrile patients. This is, again, one of the biggest overuses of antimicrobial globally, not just in developing world setting. But when patients present with febrile symptoms, especially with children, that in most cases, studies have shown that that's one of the biggest cases where if you don't send them back with something, you're not considered a good doctor, which means antibiotics are often prescribed without appropriate diagnostic. And if you sort of take a sub-Saharan Africa or India or other regions where malaria or typhoid or other diseases might be co-endemic, are you really doing justice by just taking fever as the only sign by which you're going to, or other similar non-differentiated symptoms as the only way to prescribe antibiotics? So what we're trying to do here is, can we quickly establish some kind of a triage where you do multiple different tests, as quickly and as affordably as possible to determine whether they should, if it's malaria, is that sufficient to manage the patient, or are there other things that you need to do in terms of either, vital fever, just maybe fluids, and maybe antibiotics are needed because you do suspect there's some bacteria, and how can you get to that quickly? So here what we're doing essentially is looking at some RDTs that can perhaps provide some of the early triage kind of approach, but combining that with more of a decision support tool. Again, these tools exist, so some of these RDTs have been developed for a variety of use, and there are a number of developers who come and tell us that they have the next best 5-plex and 6-plex for different combinations of pathogens that might be relevant. But how does a end user, like a healthcare worker who's going around the field, who's often the first point of contact, how do they make an informed decision on how they treat the patient or how do they manage the patient? And that's really where we're trying to put this sort of a algorithm-based decision support tool combined with some of the RDTs in what we call a diagnostics in a box approach. Can we sort of bundle these things in a way that make sense? And what we're doing now is launched a program called Diagnostics Use Accelerator, which is essentially looking at ultimately for AMR to be meaningfully addressed, we need to get to what might not be maybe okay in Berkeley, but not in many of the rest of US, to talk about universal healthcare and other kind of approaches. But globally, that's really what is needed to be able to do this and to be able to have the right tools, but in addition to the right tools, we also are focused on what kind of behavior changes need to take place, both from a prescriber perspective, but also from a patient perspective, and how do you bring all this sort of at the point of, in some cases it might be a primary healthcare provider, sometimes it could be pharmacy, depending on which country you are. Pharmacy is the first point where patients go to get some kind of a treatment option. So really in the diagnostics use accelerator, we are trying to address this from a perspective of at the first point of contact, how do we look at this from a universal healthcare and behavior change perspective. And so the last piece, which you can have the best tools, right? I mean, so what we, like I said in the beginning, the question is about if it's only about tools, there are brilliant minds and we can produce all these tools. Ultimately, it's about how do you get them to the right place. And the biggest challenge is there is a mismatch between the availability of tools and where the patients end up seeking them. So what we've also focused on, besides just focusing on access as a passive approach, really looking at it more dynamically and looking at where do these patients actually go, because ultimately, sort of the message is innovations only matter if they reach the target population where they actually are intended to do. That's really sort of what brings me back to my ice cream truck. And because who doesn't like ice cream, right? If you're in Manila, 7,000 islands, water surrounding all over the place, yet no matter which island you're in, on a hot, muggy day, you may want an ice cream. How do companies like either Unilever and, or could be other products, simple logistics, right? I mean, now this is, it could be Coke or other things. How do they get these products distributed? And there are, again, this is now not about diagnostics. This is more about logistics and management. And there are a number of software. And so we actually partnered with one of the software developers who worked with Unilever in developing sort of these global network for supply chain management and logistics and so on, looking at refrigeration. Again, if you are in diagnostic development, one of the common questions is, do you need cold chain? Does your reagent need to be stored in a 4 degrees or minus 20? Minus 20, you can forget getting them into LMICs, but even 4 degrees is hard. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with where these reagents are stored, and how do you get them to the healthcare facility quickly? So if there is an outbreak suddenly, how do you make sure that they get to the right place? So primary and secondary warehousing, where are the population distributions and so on. So, and for us, it's also looking at how countries think about distributing their resources when it comes to diagnostic devices. So typically how most of these are done is more sort of a democratic manner. If you have 30 geographically distributed districts, let's say, you may want to place one in each of the district. But majority of population is maybe in 3 districts, and the rest of them are very sparsely populated. So having just one in the majority population and one in the absolutely sparsely populated might not be the most efficient way of distributing. So the question, this is more about how do you get the resources that you need to the right place in a way that is most efficient manner. And so our vision really is to try and make sure that we take the data into account when we go through all this. And to sort of give you an example, even like I told you about the Gene Expert, which for us was one of the success stories of getting molecular diagnostics into resource-limited setting, we thought that means that universally, wherever there's TB and there's prevalence of TB, you would see use of them somewhat similarly. But you can see this across the countries. Some use it really well, and most places it's extremely underutilized. Capacity is extremely underutilized. And this is, again, a problem that cannot be just addressed by developing the next best diagnostic, because it'll face the same challenge. But it's not just across the globe. If you take, the next slide sort of focuses on Kenya, which is somewhere in the, the left of this chart. It's actually a little over 50% usage. But if you look within Kenya, look at the sort of districts across, it's not uniformly used there as well. The utilization of the available resources is extremely poor. Some are less than 50% utilized, whereas some other cases are over 100%, which means you're essentially turning patients away or not getting results in a timely manner. So the work that we're doing with this sort of logistics side of things is to try and understand how do you do this sort of what you would call a network optimization? How do you make sure that the instrument placement, where the people who are trained, the people where the patients are, sample transport, and all the other logistics that need to go in, they all, some kind of a thought goes into development. So when additional dollars come, for instance, say I can place 50 more instruments, where should I place them? Should I place them, again, one in each of the districts? Or now should I start focusing on where the needs are? So without going into sort of the details, if you sort of look at 4 different countries where we've piloted this model perspective, I'm not going to go into the details of each of these models today, but you can sort of see the complexity and sort of the densely populated. You can sort of see where, right-hand side is Kenya, Philippines, Delhi at the bottom, and Lesotho. What you see is the population density matters, distance from the site, where how far people have to travel, where these things are stored, and all of these things matter. So it's such that it's not any one thing. You can't just say, okay, go to the nearest treatment center, because the nearest treatment center may be saturated, may have capacity limitation. That may not be where you need to go. Go somewhere else. So the work, this is all ongoing work. So hopefully, as we move forward, we'll get more data and sort of support this. But it's not just about this. Is all this model was developed using TB, but we are now piloting adding. Early infant diagnosis for HIV, for instance, because TB and HIV go hand in hand in most of these settings. How do you optimize now, because similar platforms can be done for both HIV and TB? How do you bring that and resource management across multiple diseases? But then you can sort of think of adding on other diseases as well. So this is not just about any one disease. Ultimately, it's about how do you manage all the available resources. So with that, I'll stop just to sort of make a couple of quick points, which I think is most of you here will agree that diagnostics needs a forum. Diagnostic needs sort of more advocacy, because clearly without diagnostics, medicine is blind. I'll sort of repeat that. And so for us, what's really important is there is a great need for awareness building and sort of resource mobilization around focusing on appropriate diagnostics in the appropriate field of use, such that the patients or the people in these settings actually benefit from the development that is going on. Anyway, thank you very much for your time. And I think, as Julia said, we'll maybe have questions later. So thank you very much.